Hi everyone, I'm going to be talking about Middlebrow modernism and formal play in post-war French cinema. This paper is part of a research project exploring the formal and stylistic strategies of post-war French cinema in the period from the end of World War II until the late 1950s, so preceding the arrival of the French New Wave. While the work of a few post-war French directors, such as Robert Bresson and Jacques Tati, has long been established as part of the cinematic canon, most post-war French films, before those of the New Wave, have commonly been dismissed as uninteresting and uninspired. We can find this view at least as far back as 1950, when the eminent French critic Georges Sadoul complained that, despite the work of a number of talented directors, the direct and poetic contact with reality that French cinema manifested before the war had been replaced by a complacent self-indulgence in old formulas and a certain academicism. But it was the young critics of the journal Cahiers du Cinéma, seeking to position themselves against the filmmaking establishment, who were most influential in propagating the idea that most post-war French movies were lacking in creativity. The success of the artistic revolution brought about by the auteur critics and new wave filmmakers has meant that the majority of post-war French film production continues to be largely ignored in Anglo-American scholarship. My project moves beyond the traditional auteur canon to study the creative practices of post-war French cinema within a historical poetics framework. Having looked at a sample of about 170 films from this period so far, in this paper I'm going to survey some experiments with cinematic storytelling that I've found in films ranging across a variety of genres. In highlighting a few areas of narrative innovation in the post-war years, there are two main ideas I want to put forward. One is that we can see some of these films as offering viewers what David Bordwell, in his study of storytelling strategies in 1940s Hollywood cinema, has called Middlebrow modernism, a mixture of fairly classical storytelling devices with some more unusual experimental narrative techniques. My second suggestion is that some of these narrative experiments look forward to and may have encouraged the more radical formal play of 1960s modernist directors such as Jean-Luc Godard, Alain Resnais, and Alain Robbe-Grillet. One significant trend that can be found in this period is films experimenting with the possibilities of non-linear narration. Almost 20% of the films I've looked at involve some sort of temporal reordering. This includes several of the options for using flashbacks to rearrange story chronology that Bordwell discusses in relation to Hollywood cinema, including revelation flashbacks, in which a previously withheld piece of story information is presented to us, reminder flashbacks that briefly repeat part of an earlier scene, usually motivated as a character's memory, and replay flashbacks, which revisit an event we've already seen to show some aspect that was omitted the first time round. In some cases, we find filmmakers pushing the boundaries of how temporal reordering can be used to tell stories in new and striking ways. I'll mention three cases of non-linear narration from this period that use techniques we might more commonly associate with the modernist cinema of the 1960s. As in Hollywood cinema of this period, flashbacks are usually motivated by a character within the story world recounting or recalling past events. Nevertheless, as Bordwell highlights, they often move beyond the character's range of knowledge so that the character's memory can be understood as a device to motivate a shift to the past, after which a more omniscient narration takes over. The film La Ferme des Sept Péchés does something different by offering a series of flashbacks recounted by an assortment of unreliable narrators. The film is a whodunit set in the 19th century. A journalist is found murdered, and the narrative is structured around flashbacks recounted by 7 people who knew him, in which each presents him in a significantly different light, contradicting one another's testimony. One flashback shows him as mean, another as compassionate, a third as jealous, and so on. By the end of the film, we still don't know which of these incompatible versions of the past is a lie and which, if any, is the truth, and the identity of the murderer is still in doubt. The film was released in 1949, so it predates Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, which was first shown in the West in 1951. A second flashback film I'll mention is La Minute de Vérité from 1952. This is a drama of marital infidelity in which a husband, Paul, discovers that his wife, Madeleine, has been having an affair. He confronts her and she recounts the history of her extramarital relationship. This is an example of what Bordwell calls architectural flashbacks, in which the situation of the couple in the present provides a framing device for a series of flashbacks to various episodes in the past. What's interesting is how the shift into the past is initiated. In the present, Madeleine explains that she first met the man who would become her lover 10 years earlier during an evening at the theatre where Paul was flirting with another woman. She holds up her cigarette. "Does this remind you of anything?" she asks, and the camera follows her hand as she stubs out the cigarette on the wall. Here's a clip of the scene. There are no subtitles, but I think you'll get the idea.
C'est difficile, hein? C'est qu'il y a longtemps que ça durait, cette histoire-là. Déjà sous l'occupation, hein? D'abord, où l'as-tu connu?
À l'atelier, le soir de la 100e d'Anouilh.
100e d'Anouilh.
Oui? Tu ne te souviens pas que j'ai créé Circé à l'atelier, non?
Ah oui, en effet. Ah, de nom de parlant, j'avais oublié cet événement historique.
Et ça? Ça ne te rappelle rien? Franchement, pardon, je ne l'ai pas fait exprès.
Ah si, ça me rappelle une scène assez sordide. Une femme que je connaissais à peine.
Tu aurais souhaité connaître davantage.
There are two things I want to highlight here. One is how short this initial flashback is, a single shot that only lasts for about 3 seconds. The second is to point out that while most films in this period were still using dissolves to bridge the transition from present to past, here we get straight cuts that instantaneously move us back in time and then just as abruptly return us to the present. These two aspects mean that the device resembles the kind of brief memory flash that will be heralded as a revolutionary new technique when it was used several years later in Alain René's Hiroshima Mon Amour. The last example of temporal reordering I want to look at is from Le Château de Verre from 1950. The film is another drama centering on an affair, this time between Evelyne, a married woman who lives in Switzerland, and Rémy, who she meets on holiday in Italy and then visits in Paris. Near the end of the film, Evelyne resolves to return to Switzerland to break up with her husband. As she imagines the train journey and her arrival home, we're shown a close-up of her watch as she winds the hands forward, counting the hours ahead that will conclude in her announcement to her husband. As the time on her watch reaches 7 o'clock, she says, "It's finished." And at this point, something unexpected happens.
Regarde comme c'est facile. L'heure du train. Le train. Le wagon-restaurant. J'arrive à Berne. Je lui parle. Je lui ai parlé. C'est fini.
After this shot of Evelyne lying at the end of a row of bodies in what looks like a classroom, with the camera craning up to show the time as 7 o'clock, we see her husband being informed of her death in a plane crash. This is a striking shift in tone, and it seems a strange choice for the narration to jump forward like this, omitting significant story events. But suddenly, the image dissolves back to Evelyne's watch, which she now rewinds to the original time. We've returned to the scene of her in Paris with Rémy, with no time having elapsed. The story continues, and a series of delays means that Eveline misses her train and goes instead to the airport to take a plane. As Remy watches the plane take off overhead, we hear the same thundering explosion we heard earlier, presaging the plane's imminent crash. The end. The sequence of Eveline's death, then, was an unmarked flash forward, an extremely unusual option for a film of this period, and without motivation from within the story world. What we saw was not Eveline's premonition of her death, it was the film's narration rearranging events so as to create a fatalistic tone that hangs over the couple's last hours together. A second storytelling trend we find in films of this period is the representation of various types of subjectivity. This can be optical subjectivity using point-of-view shots, as in the thriller Obsession from 1954, in which we watch one character stalking another.
Aldo.
It can be auditory subjectivity, as in the romantic comedy Paris Palace Hotel from 1956, in which a young couple at a noisy party put their fingers in their ears to block out the sound, a scene that looks forward to the famous Minute of Silence in Jean-Luc Godard's Bon Départ 8 years later.
On va rester longtemps.
Je vais vous apprendre un truc amusant. Bouchez-vous bien les oreilles et regardez autour de vous.
Some films go beyond perceptual subjectivity to give us deeper access to a character's mental state. An example of this is Aux yeux du souvenir from 1948, in which the heroine, having been spurned by her pilot lover, rushes to the airport in search of him. At first, we get a series of shots from her optical point of view as, unnoticed, she watches him celebrate with his friends and head off to his plane. But later, when she collapses while sitting alone at the airport bar, the narration uses stylized sound, first-person camera work, and distorted imagery to represent her subjective experience.
Allez, c'est fini. Une nuit de repos, il n'y paraîtra plus.
Voulez-vous qu'on prévienne chez vous? Non? Vous n'avez besoin de rien. Vous préférez rester ici? Parfait. Si vous avez besoin de quoi que ce soit, ne vous gênez pas. Chef hôtesse Marinier.
Strategies such as temporal reordering and perceptual and mental subjectivity produce a more self-conscious style of narration that draws attention to its ability to manipulate story materials. In some cases, this is pushed further to create various forms of reflexivity in which a film overtly acknowledges its artificial, constructed nature. This can take the form of intertextual references, such as we find in Entre 11h et minuit from 1949, a crime drama starring the great French actor Louis Jouvet as a police inspector who takes on the identity of a murdered criminal to whom he bears an uncanny physical resemblance. The film begins with a prologue that preempts any potential criticism of the story's improbable premise. As we watch a crowd of spectators exiting a cinema, a voiceover commentary points out that several celebrated films have featured stars playing the double role of an honest man and a crook. The three examples he gives are Edward G. Robinson in The Whole Town's Talking, Charlie Chaplin in The Great Dictator, and none other than Louis Jouvet in Copie Conforme, a film he'd made 2 years earlier in which he played a criminal who discovers he has a double and uses him as a stand-in to provide an alibi for his crimes. Drawing attention not only to the general convention of film stars demonstrating their range by playing a double role, but also to the fact that Jouvet, the star of this film, had won acclaim for doing this, the prologue leaves us in no doubt that we're being invited to enjoy the actor's star performance as much as, or more than, we are to consider the story in terms of verisimilitude. Another film that starts by calling attention to its own artifice is the light-hearted whodunit La Dame Danseur from 1947. In place of a traditional opening title sequence, the film begins with a rapid montage of shots. An unseen figure fires a revolver. A syringe is filled. A car is dragged from a river. As a voiceover narrator announces that a murder has been committed, we're shown a series of potential suspects. A mysterious surgeon, a frightened woman, a snooping butler listening to an off-screen conversation, a pair of young lovers. Then, as the narrator tells us that all the characters are assembled, we see them as mask-wearing puppets lined up on a stage. Let's go back in time, the narrator announces, and a hand upends an hourglass, cueing a series of reverse motion shots. The car flies out of the river, the butler moves away from the door, and so on. Finally, the narrator tells us that we're back at the start, and the story begins. These last two examples both begin in a highly reflexive mode, but after their opening sequences, each settles down to tell its story in a relatively conventional manner. A film that maintains a considerable degree of reflexivity throughout is La Fête à Henriette from 1952, a meta-narrative that plays with different levels of narration by presenting us with a story that's embedded within the process of its own creation. The film moves between the adventures of its fictional protagonist, Henriette, and the conversations of a pair of scriptwriters, equally fictional but operating outside the diegetic world to which Henriette belongs, who write, reject, and rewrite successive versions of her story. The film's unconventionality is signalled from the start. We do get opening credits this time, but all the names are blank, including the production company, the director, the film's title, and the scriptwriters. On the soundtrack, the noise of an orchestra tuning up is interrupted by a narrator who explains that the script hasn't been written and the film hasn't been shot. We're quickly introduced to the two writers who, after having their latest screenplay refused by the censorship board, begin to brainstorm ideas for a new one, a process that's complicated by the fact that they have very different opinions about what sort of story they want to tell. Here's a short sequence from early on in the film, at which point they still haven't decided who their protagonist will be.
Des personnages quotidiens?
C'est ça, des personnages médiocres.
Non, modestes.
Attends, je verrai assez bien une grande fille blonde, mais suédoise. Là, je la vois, elle habite Saint-Germain-des-Prés, avec un poète japonais, mais lettriste. Ou bien une petite brune, insignifiante, qui dirige dans les environs de la Bastille, Un gang d'entoleuses. L'entolage à Paris. Quel sujet, hein? Les 1000 petits trucs qu'elles emploient. La chobardise des hommes.
Non, j'ai pas dit des personnages crapuleux, j'ai dit des personnages modestes.
Compris. Alors, nous commençons le film par un coup de poing. Et nous accrochons le public au premier round. Un film swing. Tiens, la Concorde. L'hôtel Crayon. Non, la place Vendôme. L'hôtel Ritz. Un appartement somptueux. Atmosphère cosmopolite. Dans ce décor luxueux et raffiné, une créature étrangement belle. Blonde.
Et suédoise.
Silence.
Entrez.
Attends, rendez-vous avec le général. Alors, c'est vrai ou c'est pas vrai?
C'est vrai. Oui? Quoi? Oui? Parker, il est dans l'ascenseur. Il monte.
Panoramique sur la porte. On frappe. Quel début. Quel suspense.
Et après?
Après, il faut trouver la suite.
Eventually, they do agree on a protagonist and her story starts to unfold on the screen. But all the way through, the film alternates between two markedly different versions of that story, one of which plays out as a thriller, the other as a romantic comedy, as the two writers argue over each other's ideas and revise the narrative as it's in the process of being presented to us. The film concludes with them presenting their script to the actor Michel Auclair, who we've seen as one of the characters within Henriette's story. But Auclair informs them that he's already made the film. In other words, the film we've just seen, the title of which, long delayed, finally appears on screen. I hope these examples give some sense of the range of narrative experimentation that took place in post-war French cinema and help to contribute to a more nuanced picture of a period that standard accounts dismiss as creatively uninspired. Returning to Baldwell's concept of Middlebrow modernism, I think we can relate this to the theory that Topp presents in his book Hollywood Aesthetic, that popular cinema aims to strike a balance between accessibility and cognitive challenge. We can understand the narrative strategies I've looked at as being intended to offer mass audiences enough novelty and complexity to sustain their interest and generate pleasure, but not so much as to confuse and overwhelm them. Of course, we need to view these strategies in their historical context. Many of them have been conventionalized over time and so offer less cognitive challenge today than they would have 70 years ago. We can also note that several of these films were particularly successful at the French box office. Les Yeux du Souvenir, for example, was the fourth most popular film of 1948. Suggesting that audiences were able to cope with and to enjoy the deviations they took from classical norms. Although there's evidence to suggest that in one instance this wasn't necessarily the case. A review of Le Château de Verre, while praising the audacity and novelty of its flash forward, mentions that it was misunderstood by some viewers. Still, even here, an extremely novel and unconventional narrative device, an unmarked flash forward, occurs within a film that for the most part is organised according to principles of classical unity. The degree of cognitive challenge offered by Le Château de Verre is nothing like as high as that offered by Last Year at Marienbad, for example, which undermines our ability to construct any sort of stable temporal relations between the story events it presents. Nevertheless, as I suggested at the start, I do think it's worth considering that the narrative experiments we find in some French films of the late 1940s and 1950s may have encouraged the next generation of filmmakers to push things further in what we can consider as a dynamic process of creative exchange and competition within the artistic field of post-war French cinema. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts at the online discussion.